Mabel Dorsey drove both knees into the mud, locked her arms underneath a stranger's shoulders, and pulled until her spine screamed, and her boots lost their grip, and she went down sideways into the wet grass with him half on top of her. She lay there breathing hard for 3 seconds. Then she got up and pulled again. Because he was dying. Because she could not walk away from a dying man. Not in this rain. Not alone. Not ever. She got him 6 feet before she stopped to look at his saddle, and the brand burned into that leather. Stopped her heart cold. A split horseshoe beneath a black pine. Her father's voice came back like a slap. That mark killed your Aunt Adeline. Don't you ever forget what that family took from us. Before we go any further, if this story already has its hands around your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that notification bell so you never miss a single chapter. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in close. This one is going to take you somewhere you did not expect to go. The fence post had been leaning wrong for 3 days, and Mabel Dorsey was the only person on the Dorsey ranch who had noticed. That was not unusual. She noticed everything. The way the south boundary wire had been pulling loose since late August. The way the gray sky off the mountains meant cold rain before noon. The way Hazel, her broad-shouldered draft mare, favored her left forefoot slightly on cold mornings and needed an extra 5 minutes of walking before she moved right. Mabel had been noticing things on this ranch since she was old enough to follow her mother out to the barn, and what she had learned over 29 years of noticing was that small wrongnesses, left unaddressed, became large catastrophes. And large catastrophes on a struggling horse ranch outside Cottonwood Divide, Colorado, in the autumn of 1889, were the kind of thing that did not leave room for recovery. So she pulled on her heaviest work coat before breakfast, tucked the wire pliers into her belt, and took Hazel out into the rain. She found the blood before she found him. It was on the top rail of the south fence, dark and already thinning in the downpour, spread in a long diagonal streak, the kind of mark a hand makes when it grabs for something and slides. Mabel pulled Hazel up short and sat for a moment looking at it. Then she looked at the grass on the far side of the fence, flattened, pressed down in the direction of the hollow below the ridge line. She tied Hazel to this post and climbed through the wire without giving herself time to deliberate, because deliberating was what you did when you had the luxury of time, and whatever had left that blood did not have that luxury. She found him in the hollow. 30 feet from the fence line on his side in the wet grass, one arm bent wrong beneath him, his hat gone, his dark hair plastered flat against his forehead. A bay gelding stood nearby with its head hanging and its side still heaving, the posture of an animal that had been pushed past every reasonable limit and had simply stopped. Mabel crossed to the man and crouched and pressed 2 fingers against his throat. Pulse. Weak. There. She put her hand near his mouth. Breath. Shallow and too fast, but breath. Hey. She said it sharp. Wake up. Can you hear me? Nothing. Louder. Hey, I need you to open your eyes, right now. His hand moved. Not toward her, just a blind reaching motion, the way a man grabs for something in a dream. His eyelids dragged open. His eyes were very dark, and for a moment they looked at nothing, looked straight through her, and then they found her face, and held it with the concentrated effort of a man who was not certain whether he was awake. Horse, he said. The word came out scraped raw. Mabel blinked. Of everything she had expected the first word out of a half-dead stranger to be, that was not it. He's standing, she said. He's right behind me. He's exhausted, but he's standing. You need to think about yourself right now. The man turned his head slightly toward the sound of the gelding's breathing. The motion cost him. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the way his breath caught and steadied deliberately. Is he lame? He said. Still not quite a question. The words of a man finishing a thought he'd been working on for a long time. I don't know yet. I just found you both. She looked at his shoulder, dark with blood on the left side, the fabric of his shirt soaked through and stiffening at the edges. How long have you been lying here? He didn't answer. Hey. She touched his uninjured shoulder, not gently. Don't go under again. How long? Don't know. Each word arrived separately. Horse spooked, rattler on the ridge, threw me into the fence post. A pause in which he breathed carefully. Couldn't get back up. She looked at the fence line, looked at the distance between it and where he lay. He'd crawled this far through the dark and the rain, and then run out of whatever had been keeping him moving. Given the state of both him and the gelding, he'd been here most of the night. "I'm getting my horse," she said. "Don't move." He muttered a sound that might have been agreement. Getting him back to shelter was not simple, and it was not graceful, and there was no version of it that didn't require Mabel to use every pound of her body's strength in ways that would leave her sore for a week. She knew her own strength, the way she knew everything useful about herself, through necessity, through years of work that didn't stop because she was tired, or because her back hurt, or because a task was technically too large for one person. She folded a blanket into a sling, worked it underneath him by rolling him in careful stages, talking to him the whole time, telling him what she was doing, and why, partly because she'd read that unconscious people sometimes heard, and partly because her own voice kept her focused. "I'm going to tie this to Hazel's saddle horn," she told him. "She's going to do most of the pulling. You just need to stay still." He said something that wasn't words. "That's fine," she said. "Stay still." Hazel pulled without complaint, steady and deliberate the way she did everything. Mabel walked alongside, one hand on the rope, watching the man's face for signs of pain that would mean she was doing something wrong, correcting the angle twice when the ground dipped. By the time they reached the abandoned herder's cabin at the edge of the Dorsey property, close enough to the south boundary to be inconvenient, far enough from the main house that her father wouldn't see it from the porch. Her shoulders were burning and her boots were soaked through to the wool. She got him inside, got him onto the rope cot in the corner, cut away enough of his shirt to see the shoulder wound clearly. Not a bullet, a deep gash from hitting a fence post at speed. Ugly but survivable if it didn't go bad, and packed it with clean cloth from Hazel's saddlebag. She'd done worse on horses. She understood wound management. She did not let herself think about anything except the next practical step. His fever came up fast. By midday, he was burning skin dry and scorching under her palm, breathing rapid and shallow. Mabel made 2 trips back to the main house, one for medicine, one for food and extra blankets. She brought Hazel and the bay gelding into the Dorsey stable on the first trip without letting herself examine what that decision meant, because examining it would have required her to make a different one. It was when she was hanging the bay's saddle over the stall rail that she saw it. She had not looked at it before. She had been looking at the man, and then at the wound, and then at the fever, because that was the order priorities demanded. But she was hanging the saddle, and the morning light from the barn door came through at the right angle and fell across the skirt of the leather, and she saw the brand burned there, and her hands stopped moving. A split horseshoe beneath a black pine. She stood in the barn aisle and did not move. She had known that brand since she was 11 years old. Her father had sat her down at the kitchen table after a trip to town and used the voice he reserved for things that mattered. Quiet, deliberate, each word placed carefully as a stone, and told her that she was never to go near Black Pine Ranch, never to speak to anyone named Voss, never to accept anything from that family or conduct any business with them, not now, not ever. Not for any reason she could imagine. He had told her what they had done. He had told her about the fire. He had told her about Adeline, Aunt Adeline, who Mabel had been too young to remember clearly, who existed in the Dorsey house as a permanent weight in the photograph on the mantel, in the particular quality of her father's silence when someone said her name in the burned section of the east pasture that Orson had never rebuilt and never explained. Adeline had been brave and sharp-minded and entirely unafraid, and she had died in a fire on a September night 18 years ago, and the Voss family had caused it, and Orson Dorsey had spent every day since making sure his daughter understood that some names were not safe to say out loud. Mabel stood in the barn aisle with her hands on the saddle and understood that the man lying in the herder's cabin was a Voss. She had brought him here herself. She had done it with her own hands and her own mare and her own rope. Her father would not see the distinction between that and an invitation. She stood there long enough that Hazel turned her head and looked at her with one patient gray eye, the expression of an animal accustomed to waiting for a human to finish thinking. "I know," Mabel said to the mare. She picked up a brush and started working the dried mud out of the bay gelding's coat, because the horse had done nothing wrong and didn't deserve to suffer for whatever his rider's name turned out to mean. Then she went back to the cabin with the medicine. I was conscious when she came through the door. Barely his eyes open, tracking her movement across the cabin with the careful focus of a man using most of his available resources just to stay present. He'd tried to shift himself on the cot. She could tell by the way he was positioned that he'd made the attempt and then abandoned it. "You shouldn't have moved," she said. "Wasn't sure where I was." His voice was clearer than that morning, scraped down to something honest by the fever. "Wasn't sure anyone knew I was here." "I know you're here." She pulled the stool close and sat down and held out the medicine bottle. "Drink this. It tastes terrible. Drink it anyway." He looked at the bottle. "What is it?" "Something my mother made. Willow bark and a few other things. It'll bring the fever down." She didn't elaborate. He studied her face for a moment. She got the impression he was reading it the way you read a landscape you weren't familiar with, looking for landmarks, and then he took the bottle and drank. His expression confirmed everything she'd warned him about. "Who are you?" he said. "Mabel Dorsey," she said. "This is Dorsey land you fell on." Something moved across his face. She watched it move. It wasn't guilt, and it wasn't fear. It was the expression of a man receiving information he had already considered the possibility of and was now confirming. "I found your saddle," she said. "I know who you ride for." The cabin went very quiet. Outside, the rain had slowed to something steady and gray. The bay gelding shifted in the stable nearby, hooves against the dirt floor. The sound of the fever in his breathing filled the spaces between words. "My name is Silas Voss," he said. "Silas Calder Voss, Gideon's son." "I know whose son you are." "Then you know what your father believes about mine." "I know what my father told me," Mabel said. "That's not always the same as knowing." He looked at her, then really looked, the kind of looking that wasn't about attraction or assessment, but about trying to understand what kind of person was sitting 3 feet away from him. She held the look without flinching. She had grown up learning not to flinch, because flinching in this county meant giving people confirmation of whatever they'd already decided about you, and Mabel had spent 29 years refusing to confirm other people's decisions. "Gideon died in April," Silas said. "I came back for the burial, went through what he left afterward." A breath. He wasn't a man who talked much. Most of his life was in account books and horse records. But those last days when he was still lucid, he stopped, started again. He kept saying the same thing, 4 or 5 times. "We blamed the wrong man. I thought it was fever talking." His jaw tightened. "I don't think that anymore." "What changed your mind?" Mabel said before she could stop herself. "I found something in his papers. Half of an old cattle sale receipt, 1871, and a hand-drawn map." He looked at the cabin ceiling, then back at her. 3 words written on the back in his handwriting. "Adeline hid everything." Mabel did not move. "Your father's account," she said after a moment, keeping her voice level, the way you kept a lamp steady in wind, "doesn't include any version of events where Gideon Voss was seeking truth. It includes a version where Gideon Voss caused a fire that killed my aunt and destroyed everything we had and walked away from it because he had more money and better lawyers." "I know that's the account." "You're not arguing with it." "I don't know the full truth of that night," Silas said. "I'm not going to stand here and claim I do. I came back to Colorado because my dying father told me we had it wrong, and I can't leave that alone. I was riding your boundary because I was looking for whoever worked this land, looking to talk to somebody." The ghost of something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. Something smaller and more tired. "Instead, I fell off my horse and you dragged me out of the mud." "Yes," Mabel said. "That's about the shape of it." "I owe you my life, Miss Dorsey." "You owe me nothing. I didn't do it for you." She stood and picked up the empty cup. "I did it because leaving a dying man in the rain would have been wrong. That has nothing to do with your name." She was at the door when he spoke again. "How long do I have?" he said. "Before your father gets back." She turned. He was watching her with those fever-bright eyes, and the question was practical, not frightened. The question of a man taking stock of the situation he was in and calculating what it gave him to work with. "Less than a week," she said. "Maybe 6 days. That's enough time." "For what?" "To find the well," he said. The map marks an abandoned stone well near the Dorsey Voss property line. If Adeline hid something, if there's anything left of it after 18 years. He stopped and breathed carefully through his nose. 6 days might be enough. Mabel looked at him for a long moment. "You can barely sit up," she said. "I'll be walking by tomorrow." "You will not be walking by tomorrow." "Day after then." "Silas Voss," she said. And the name felt strange in her mouth, like a word in a language she'd been forbidden to speak. "You are going to stay in this cabin. You are not going near the main house. You are not going to make yourself visible to anyone on that road. And you are going to let that shoulder heal before you start making plans that require you to stay on a horse." "Yes, ma'am," he said without a trace of argument, which unsettled her more than argument would have. She went back to the main house in the rain, and she sat at the kitchen table without lighting the lamp, and she stayed there a long time in the gray afternoon. Adeline hid everything. The weight of those 3 words settled into the room around her like weather. Her whole life, she had known the story of her aunt's death, the way she knew the story of the ranch, obliquely in pieces, through the grief of a man who could not speak about it directly. Orson Dorsey was not a demonstrative person. He showed love through work and worry through checking the fence line himself before he let Mabel do it through riding to Glenwood Springs to find a better breeding stallion, because the Dorsey horses deserved better blood. He did not discuss feelings. He did not discuss the past. But Adeline's photograph stayed on the mantel, and the burned section of the east pasture stayed unbuilt. And every spring, without explanation, Orson took the photograph down and cleaned the frame with a cloth, slowly, the way a person maintains something they cannot bear to put away. Mabel pressed her palms flat on the table. She had known her aunt had been watching something that last season. Her father had said it once in one of those rare, unguarded moments that happened sometimes late in winter when the cold got long enough to wear a person's guard down. She knew something was wrong, he'd said. She was going to the sheriff. 3 days before the fire, she told me she had what she needed to go to the sheriff. She'd never gotten there. If there was something hidden in a stone well near the property line. If Gideon Voss had known about it. If his dying words were true, rather than fever. Then the hatred her father had built his life around for 18 years was sitting on a foundation that had never been properly examined. She did not sleep that night. She was back at the cabin before first light with food and a clean dressing and the particular determination of a woman who has made a decision she hasn't fully admitted to herself yet. Silas was awake, sitting up on the cot with the careful, deliberate posture of a man managing serious pain without making it anyone else's problem. His color was better. The fever had broken sometime in the night. "You look worse than yesterday," he said when she came through the door. "I didn't sleep. Thinking about the well. Thinking about my aunt." She set the food down and sat on the stool and looked at him directly. "Tell me everything that was in your father's papers. Everything, not just the receipt and the map. Everything," he told her. He talked for an hour. His voice still rough but steady. And Mabel listened, the way she listened to everything that mattered, without interrupting, without showing on her face what she was thinking. Storing each piece of information in the careful mental accounting system she'd developed over years of running a ranch on a ledger that never quite balanced. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The initial on the last page of Adeline's statement," she said. "HP," he said. "That's all that survived. The rest of the page was water damaged." "HP," she said. She said it quietly, and something in the way she said it made Silas watch her face. "You know who that is," he said. "I don't know anything yet," Mabel said. "I know who those initials fit. That's different from knowing." She stood up. "Eat. Rest that shoulder. Don't walk on it today." "Miss Dorsey." She stopped at the door. "You saved my life before you knew whether I deserved it," he said. "That's not a small thing. I want you to know I understand that." Mabel thought about her father's voice saying that Mark killed your Aunt Adeline. She thought about Adeline's photograph on the mantel cleaned every spring with a careful cloth. She thought about 3 words in a dead man's handwriting and a stone well near a boundary line and 18 years of hatred that had never once been examined from the other side. "Don't make me regret it," she said. She walked out into the dark before sunrise, and the cold air off the mountains hit her face, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called once and went silent. The fence post still needed fixing. She picked up her tools and walked toward the south boundary with the particular set of her shoulders that meant she had already decided something, she just hadn't finished deciding what it was going to cost her. The night was giving way to gray, and Mabel Dorsey, who had spent 29 years on land that was slowly losing its fight against time and debt and other people's opinions of her, walked toward the boundary line between her family and the family she had been raised to fear, carrying a decision she hadn't named yet in her chest, like an ember that hadn't decided whether it was going to die out or catch. The morning Silas Voss stood up on his own. For the first time he walked to the cabin door, opened it 6 inches, and looked out at the Dorsey ranch with the careful, contained expression of a man who understood exactly how much of what he was seeing he had no right to. Mabel was in the paddock with a lame mare. She didn't know he was watching. That was clear enough from the way she worked, unself-conscious, completely absorbed, crouched low beside the mare's left foreleg, with both hands, moving slow and deliberate, talking to the animal the whole time in the low continuous murmur that good horsewomen used, the way other people used silence. The mare was nervous. Anyone could see that the way she kept shifting her weight, the way her ears moved in short, anxious arcs. But she wasn't pulling away. She was letting Mabel's hands stay on her. Silas watched for 3 minutes before he pulled the door closed again. He sat back down on the cot and looked at his hands and thought about his father's voice saying, "We blamed the wrong man," and felt the familiar ache of something that had not yet resolved itself into either grief or guilt or anger, but existed somewhere in the complicated territory between all three. When Mabel came in an hour later with his midday meal, he said, "The bay mare in the far paddock, her left foreleg above the fetlock. She's been compensating for something that started higher up." Mabel set the food down and looked at him. "How long have you been watching?" she said. "Long enough to see you already know that," he said. "I'm not telling you something you don't know. I'm telling you that I see what you see." She pulled the stool out and sat down and studied him with the expression she wore when she was deciding how much of herself to extend into a conversation. He had learned that expression in the 3 days since she'd pulled him out of the mud. It was not unfriendly. It was careful the way a person got careful when they'd been wrong about something important before, and were committed to not being wrong in the same way twice. "She's been off since July," Mabel said. "I've treated the foreleg twice. It keeps coming back." "Because the problem isn't in the foreleg," Silas said. "It's in the hip. The way she shifts her weight when she stands, she's avoiding something higher. The foreleg is where she shows it, because that's where the compensation lands." A silence. Then, "My father's farrier said the same thing in August. My father didn't want to pay for a second opinion." "And you couldn't override him." "I can suggest things," Mabel said evenly. "I can't override him. It's his ranch." Silas looked at her. "Is it?" he said, not unkindly. She picked up her hat from the nail on the wall she'd left it when she came in and turned it in her hands once, then set it back on the nail. "What would you do for the hip?" she said. "If it were your horse?" He told her. He talked her through it step by step, the way he'd have talked a younger trainer through it, without condescension, without performing expertise, just laying out the process, the way you laid out the parts of something you were going to fix. She listened, the way she always listened, completely still, taking everything in, occasionally asking a question that demonstrated she'd understood 3 steps ahead of where he was currently talking. By the end of it, she was nodding slowly. "I've got the liniment for that," she said. "I've had it on the shelf since spring." "You already figured it out," he said. "I figured out what the problem was," she said. "I didn't have anyone to confirm it was worth starting the treatment without a vet." "I'm not a vet." "No," she said. "But you know horses." She left and came back 40 minutes later with the liniment on her hands and the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had done something she'd been waiting to do for too long. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't need to. It was in the way she moved the slight loosening around her shoulders that meant something had been resolved. "The well," Silas said. "I can ride in 2 days." "You cannot ride in 2 days." "I can ride in 2 days." He said in the tone of a man who had assessed the situation accurately and was reporting results. "The shoulder is healing. You did good work on it. Flattery won't make bone knit faster. It's not flattery, it's a fact. He met her eyes. 2 days, Mabel. Your father gets back in 4. If we're going to do this before he returns, we go in 2 days. She had been standing near the door. At the use of her given name the first time he'd used it, though she'd given it to him the first day without thinking. Something shifted slightly in her posture. Not withdrawal. More like the adjustment a person made when a room got unexpectedly warmer than they'd prepared for. I'll think about it, she said. That means yes, he said. It means I'll think about it, she said, and left. But she came back the next morning with the map. She spread it on the small table near the cot, and they looked at it together, her standing him, sitting close enough that he could smell the clean wool of her coat and the faint wood smoke she carried from the main house fireplace. The map was hand-drawn, the lines steady but old, the ink browned with time. The stone well was marked with a small cross near the boundary line in a section of land that backed up against a rocky outcropping Mabel knew as Adder's Ledge, useless for grazing, too steep for cultivation. The kind of place that existed on ranch boundaries because no one had ever had a reason to clear it. I know that ledge, she said. I've ridden past it 100 times. Did you ever go into it? No reason to. Adeline had a reason, Silas said. Mabel's finger was on the map. She didn't move it. She would have needed somewhere isolated, she said slowly, thinking out loud rather than talking to him the way she sometimes did when she forgot to guard herself. Somewhere she could leave something safely. Somewhere no one would stumble over it by accident, but that she could describe well enough for someone else to find if... She stopped. If something happened to her, Silas said quietly. The map lay between them on the table. She knew it was dangerous, Mabel said. Whatever she found, whatever she was planning to take to the sheriff, she knew going in that it was dangerous. Her voice was level. Absolutely level, the way a person's voice got when they were controlling it carefully. She hid the evidence, and then she died before she could tell anyone where. Except she did tell someone, Silas said. She told my father. Mabel looked up from the map. They were working together, she said. Not a question. That's what the receipt suggests. And the map came from Gideon's papers, which means she gave it to him, or he found it afterward. Silas leaned forward, slightly careful with the shoulder. Mabel, your father believes Gideon Voss killed Adeline, but Gideon spent 18 years carrying a map to where her evidence was hidden. A guilty man destroys evidence. He doesn't protect it. The cabin was very quiet. Outside, a horse shifted in the stable. A crow called twice somewhere above the ridge and went silent. The wind off the mountains moved through the gap under the cabin door and stirred the edges of the old map. 2 days, Mabel said finally. 2 days. Silas agreed. She folded the map and put it in her coat pocket and left without another word. He listened to her footsteps cross the yard back toward the main house, steady and even and deliberate, the walk of a woman who had made a decision and was not going to let herself reconsider it. He lay back on the cot and stared at the ceiling and thought that he had met a great many people in his 34 years, and he could not immediately think of one who had surprised him more thoroughly in less time. The 2 days passed in the particular way that days passed when you were waiting for something too slowly in the ordinary moments, and then suddenly gone. The morning of the 3rd day, arriving before Silas felt entirely ready for it. His shoulder was functional, which was not the same thing as healed, and Mabel looked at it with the critical eye of someone who would have preferred another week, but understood that another week was not available. If you fall off, she said, helping him work his arm into his repaired shirt, I am not dragging you out of another hollow. Fair enough, he said. I mean it. I know you mean it. Good. They rode out before the town was awake. Silas on Cato, who had recovered better than his rider, and Mabel on Hazel the draft mare, moving with her usual patient authority across the wet autumn grass. The boundary line between Dorsey land and the scrub territory around Adder's Ledge was marked by a crumbling stone wall that neither family had maintained in years, and they crossed it without ceremony and picked their way up into the rocky ground beyond. The well was where the map said it would be. It was collapsed on the south side, the stone fallen inward, the opening reduced to a narrow gap where the original structure had been, but it was there half hidden by the growth of 18 years and the general indifference of land that no one had visited with any purpose. Mabel dismounted and walked to it and crouched and looked into the gap. "Something's in there," she said. "How far down?" "Not far." The collapse brought the bottom up. She reached in, careful with her arm's angle, feeling along the stone. "There's something metal. A box." She worked it out with both hands, slowly, the rusted metal scraping against the stone, and when it finally came free, it was smaller than either of them had expected. A document box, the kind a practical woman would use for correspondence, with a latch so corroded it took Silas's knife to open it. Inside were papers, old papers, protected by the metal from water, though not entirely from time. Ranch documents, correspondence, and at the bottom, several pages written in a woman's careful hand that Mabel recognized without being told. She recognized it because she had seen that handwriting on the back of envelopes in the kitchen drawer. Letters Adeline had sent to Orson in the year before she died, that Orson had kept bundled with a piece of string and never shown anyone. "This is her writing," Mabel said. Her voice did not shake. She held the pages as though they were something that could break, which they could. "This is Adeline's handwriting," she read. Silas did not push her or ask questions. He stood beside Cato with his hand on the horse's neck and waited the way a man waited when he understood that what was happening in front of him was not his to hurry. It took Mabel a long time. When she looked up, her face was careful and still, and somewhere behind her eyes something had shifted, permanently, the way things shifted when you learned a truth that couldn't be unlearned. She knew him, Mabel said. She knew Harlan Pike was stealing horses. She documented it. Brands altered dates of sale that didn't match the dates of transfer animals that appeared in Pike's sale records 6 weeks after they went missing from either this land or your father's. She held up the last page. She was going to take this to the county sheriff. She wrote to Gideon Voss because he'd lost animals too, and she needed a corroborating witness. Her hand tightened on the page. The last line of this letter says she planned to meet him on the night of... She stopped. "The night of the fire," Silas said. "Yes," Mabel said. They looked at each other across the rusted box and the old papers and the collapsed well and 18 years of a hatred that had just had its foundation pulled out from under it. "H.P.," Silas said quietly. "Harlan Pike." "Harlan Pike," Mabel said. "My father's closest friend for 18 years. Her voice was absolutely flat. Controlled so completely it had gone past emotional entirely and come out the other side into something colder and more dangerous. "My father's closest friend, who has been in our kitchen every winter, who helped my father file the original complaint against Gideon Voss, who has been telling my father for 18 years that the Voss family destroyed ours." Silas said nothing. There was nothing to say. Mabel stood up. She put the papers carefully back in the box, folded the lid down, tucked the box under her arm, and walked to Hazel and mounted with the efficient movements of a woman who had decided on a direction and was moving toward it. "We're going to Cottonwood Divide," she said. "The county records office will have the original complaint documents and the horse sale records from that period. If Adeline's documentation matches what's filed there..." "It will," Silas said. "I know," Mabel said. "I want proof that's in county records. I want something my father cannot dismiss." She turned Hazel toward the road. That was when they heard the rider. Harlan Pike came up the road from the south, the way he always came, unhurried, comfortable in his saddle, a man so accustomed to moving through this county without obstruction that he had long since stopped bothering to check what might be in his path. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and heavy-jawed, with the kind of weathered authority that came from decades of being the biggest person in most rooms. He rode with Wes Cutter, who worked his south pasture, a quiet, obedient man who had the look of someone who had been useful to Harlan for long enough that he'd stopped asking what he was being useful for. Harlan pulled up short when he saw them. His eyes went to Silas first, specifically to the healed but still visible gash on his forehead, and to the black pine brand on Cato's saddle skirt, and then to Mabel, and then to the metal box under Mabel's arm. Something changed in his face. It was fast. Very fast, the way a curtain moved when someone behind it shifted their weight. But Mabel had been watching faces her whole life, and she caught it. Fear, she thought. Not surprise. Fear. He's seen that box before. Mabel, Harlan said. His voice had the warm, easy cadence of a man performing a version of himself he'd been performing for a very long time. What in the world are you doing all the way out here? And who is this? Harlan, Mabel said. Your father know you're out riding with... His eyes went to Silas again. Company. My father is in Glenwood Springs, Mabel said. As you well know. I heard he was away, Harlan said easily. That's partly why I rode up. Wanted to check on you, make sure things were in order. His gaze dropped to the box again. What have you got there? Old ranch documents, Mabel said. Nothing that concerns you. The curtain moved again behind his eyes. Where'd you find those? He said, and the easy cadence had slipped by 1 degree, not enough for Wes Cutter to notice, but enough for Mabel, who was looking for it. Does it matter? She said. I'm just asking, Harlan said. Out of concern. He looked at Silas. I don't believe we've met. Silas Voss, Silas said. He said it straight and flat and without any attempt to soften the name. Harlan's jaw went still. Not tight. Still the particular stillness of a man whose body had just received information his face was working hard not to respond to. A Voss, he said after a beat. Mabel, what are you thinking? Your father would be, do you know what this looks like? A Voss man out here on Dorsey land. He's not on Dorsey land, Mabel said. We're on the scrub ground above Adder's Ledge. No one's land. Does it matter when your father hears? When my father hears, Mabel said, I'll be the one to tell him, not you. A beat of silence. Harlan looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before in 18 years of knowing him. She'd seen him avuncular. She'd seen him concerned. She'd seen him generous and jovial and occasionally stern with hired men who disappointed him. She had not seen him calculating. She was seeing it now. Mabel, he said quieter. Whatever this man has told you, whatever he's brought here, whatever story he's spinning, you need to think about your father. Think about what this does to Orson. You start digging up old ground, you're going to hurt him. Is that what you want? It was well done. She had to admit, it was well done. The appeal to her father, the suggestion that her digging was the harmful act, rather than whatever the digging might uncover. If she had been anyone else, if she had been the woman Harlan had always assumed she was, the quiet, practical, unremarkable daughter of a grieving man, too heavy and too plain to have ambitions beyond keeping the ranch running, she might have felt uncertain. She didn't feel uncertain. She felt something clarify. Harlan, she said, I've spent my whole life in this county being underestimated. By men in town, by neighbors, by people who looked at me and decided I wasn't worth their complete attention. She kept her voice even, conversational. You know what that teaches you? It teaches you to listen, really listen. Because when people think you're too insignificant to matter, they stop being careful about what they say in front of you. She shifted the metal box under her arm. You've said a lot of things in front of me over the years, Harlan. I've been listening the whole time. Harlan's face went very still. You should go, Mabel said. I'll tell my father you came to check on things. A long moment. Then Harlan turned his horse and rode back down the road without another word. Wes Cutter following, and Mabel sat on Hazel and watched him go, and felt her heart beating very fast beneath the surface of the absolute calm she was presenting to the world. He recognized the box, Silas said quietly when they were gone. Yes, Mabel said. He knew exactly what's in it. Yes. Which means he's known it existed for 18 years and never found it. He looked, Mabel said. I'd wager everything I own that he looked. She turned Hazel toward the road to town. Which means Adeline hid it well enough that an 18-year search couldn't turn it up, but she trusted your father with enough information to find it. She trusted him, Silas said. And my father kept that trust for 18 years without ever knowing whether it mattered. While my father blamed him for her death, Mabel said quietly. They rode toward Cottonwood Divide in a silence that was not uncomfortable, but was very heavy. The kind of silence that happened when two people were each carrying their own version of the same grief and hadn't yet found the words to put them down in the same place. The trouble with Cottonwood Divide was that it was a small town, and small towns in 1889 ran on the currency of other people's business and two riders. One of them recognizably, Mabel Dorsey, the other carrying a brand that half the old-timers in the county could identify at 50 yards arriving together on a Tuesday morning, was the kind of event that moved through Main Street faster than either of them could have anticipated. By the time they tied their horses outside the county records office, three people had already found reasons to be standing within conversational distance of the door. Mabel walked past them without acknowledging they were there. Inside the records office, she asked for the original complaint documents from the fire of 1871. She asked for horse sale records from the same period the 2 years preceding and the year following. She asked for the brand alteration reports filed with the county in 1870 and 1871. The county clerk, a thin young man named Ellsworth, who had never in his life been asked to find so many documents at once, and who looked slightly overwhelmed by the specificity of the request, went to find them. While he was gone, Silas said, "You knew exactly what to ask for." "I've been managing my father's accounts for 12 years, Mabel said. "I know what paperwork looks like when something is being hidden inside it." Ellsworth came back. He stacked the documents on the counter with the slightly bewildered expression of a man who had expected a simple transaction and found himself in the middle of something he didn't have the context to understand. Mabel opened the first file. The horse sale records were there. Dates, descriptions, brand marks recorded at the time of transfer. She laid Adeline's documentation out beside them and began comparing, running her finger down the columns, the way she ran her finger down an account ledger, looking for the numbers that didn't belong. They were there. Animals appearing in Pike's sale records within 6 to 8 weeks of disappearing from Dorsey and Voss stock lists. Brand descriptions that matched the alteration process Adeline had documented. Sale prices that were too low for the quality of animal, unless the seller was moving the merchandise quickly and didn't want to invite questions. The county records confirmed every word of Adeline's statement. "This is enough," Silas said quietly, looking over her shoulder. "It's enough for the records office," Mabel said. "It's not enough for my father. My father needs to see Adeline's handwriting. He needs to read her words." Her voice, which had stayed controlled for the past 2 hours through everything, through the well, through Harlan on the road, through the long ride into town, tightened briefly, just once, just enough to show she was human. He spent 18 years believing a lie because someone he trusted told it to him. "I need the truth to come from someone he can't dismiss." "Who?" Silas said. The door of the records office opened. Mabel turned. Harlan Pike walked in. He was not alone. He had 2 men with him now, not just Wes Cutter, but Deke Alderman, who ran the livery stable, and had been in Harlan's pocket since before Mabel was born, and the easy avuncular manner was entirely gone. What remained was the careful weighted authority of a man who had decided that conversation had run its course. "Mabel," he said, "I think it's time you and I talked privately." "I think," Mabel said without moving, "that you've had 18 years of privacy. I'm not especially interested in giving you any more." "You don't understand what you're looking at," he said. "Those old records, there's context you're missing. If you'll let me explain." "Harlan." Mabel laid her hand flat on the documents. "I have Adeline Dorsey's original statement in her own handwriting, describing in precise detail what you were doing with both families' horses. I have county records that confirm every transaction she documented. I have a witness, one I haven't spoken to yet, but one I know exists because Adeline names him in her second letter, who was on that property the night of the fire." She looked at him directly. "What context am I missing?" The room had gone very quiet. Ellsworth had backed up against the far wall and was doing his best to be invisible, which Mabel understood completely and bore him no ill will for. Harlan looked at Silas. "This is a Voss," he said, turning to the 2 men behind him. "This is a Voss man come back here after everything his family did to the Dorseys," filling Mabel's head with, "Don't," Mabel said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be loud. "Don't bring his name into this to protect yours," she said. Don't stand there and use my father's grief as a shield for the second time. You did it 18 years ago. You told my father what to believe while he was too destroyed to think clearly, and it worked, and my family spent 18 years hating the wrong man." Her hand pressed harder on the documents beneath it. "It is not going to work again." Harlan looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time in the 18 years she had known him, Mabel saw Harlan Pike without the performance, without the warmth and the concern and the avuncular authority, and what was underneath it was smaller and older and more frightened than she had expected. "Your father," he said quietly, "is not going to thank you for this." "My father," Mabel said, "is going to have to make his own peace with it. That's between him and God and whatever's left of his friendship with you." She picked up Adeline's documents and stacked them carefully with the county records. "But he is going to know the truth. All of it. From me." The door of the records office opened a second time. Orson Dorsey walked in. He was dusty from the road, and he was tired, and he was already scanning the room with the particular look he wore when something had reached him before he could reach it, and his eyes found Mabel first, and then the documents on the counter, and then Silas, and the expression on his face. When he registered, Silas's presence moved through surprise and into something that in another man might have been called rage. "Mabel," he said, "what in God's name?" "Papa," she said, "sit down. Who is that man?" "Papa, sit down, please." She held out Adeline's letter. "I need you to read something, in your sister's handwriting, and I need you to read it before you say another word." Orson's eyes went to the handwriting on the first page. He went very still. The room held its breath, and Mabel stood in the middle of everything she had spent 2 weeks pulling toward this moment. The mud and the rain and the fever, Vigil and the stone well, and the rusted box, and the long ride toward truth along a boundary line that was no longer what either family had believed it to be, and she waited for her father to read the words his dead sister had left in the ground like a seed, waiting 18 years for someone to finally come looking. Orson Dorsey read slowly. That was the thing Mabel noticed first, not his expression, not his breathing, not the way his hands held the pages. The speed. Her father was not a slow reader. He had run accounts and contracts and county filings for 30 years, and he moved through written words the way he moved through familiar land efficiently and without hesitation. But he read Adeline's letter slowly. He read it the way a man reads something he was hoping would change meaning if he went carefully enough. The way a man read something he needed to be wrong. Nobody in the records office moved. Harlan Pike stood near the door with Wes Cutter and Deke Alderman behind him, and Harlan's face had settled into the expression of a man who had not yet decided which direction to run. Silas stood to Mabel's left close enough that she could feel the careful tension in him present, watchful, ready for whatever the next 60 seconds produced, but not inserting himself into a moment that belonged to a father and daughter and the dead woman between them. Ellsworth the clerk had pressed himself so thoroughly against the back wall that he had nearly become a part of it. Orson turned the last page. He held it for a moment, not reading anymore, just holding it. Then he set it down on the counter with the deliberate care of a man setting down something fragile, and he looked at Mabel, and what was in his face was not what she had expected. She had expected anger. She had expected the particular defensive fury of a man whose certainties were being challenged. The fury she had seen aimed at ranch hands who questioned his judgment, at neighbors who suggested his methods were outdated, at the world in general when it declined to behave the way Orson Dorsey had decided it should. What was in his face was not anger. It was the expression of a man who had just watched the floor drop away beneath something he'd been standing on for 18 years, and who had not yet decided whether to fall or grab for something. "Where did you find this?" he said. His voice was very quiet. "The stone well above Adder's Ledge," Mabel said. "Near the boundary line. There was a map in Gideon Voss's papers. Adeline hid the box there the week before the fire." Orson's eyes went to Silas. "This is Gideon's boy," he said, not a question. "Silas Voss," Silas said. He said it the way he always said it, straight, without apology, without aggression. Orson looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes that Mabel could not entirely read, grief and recognition, and something older and more complicated than either. "You look like him," Orson said finally. Around the eyes. So I've been told, Silas said. Another silence. Then Orson turned to look at Harlan, and that was when the room changed, because the look on Orson Dorsey's face, when he turned to his oldest friend of 18 years, was not the look of a man seeking explanation. It was not the look of a man offering benefit of the doubt. It was the look of a man who had read his dead sister's handwriting, describing in precise and careful detail what Harlan Pike had done, and who was running 18 years of memory back through what he now knew, and watching things reorder themselves into a shape he could not escape. Harlan, Orson said. Orson. Harlan moved forward, hands slightly open at his sides, the gesture of a man demonstrating he was unarmed. Whatever Mabel has told you, whatever she's found, you need to hear my side of this. There's context here that... Were you stealing horses from my land? Orson said. Flat. Direct. No space in the question for deflection. Harlan's hands closed. That's a serious accusation, he said. Coming from old documents that could have been written by anyone. Were you stealing horses from my land? Orson said again. Exactly the same words. Exactly the same tone. The tone of a man who had decided that this question was going to get an answer, regardless of what it cost. Orson, listen to me. That is not an answer. Your daughter has been filling your head with Harlan. Orson's voice dropped to something so quiet, it was almost worse than shouting. I have known you 30 years. I trusted you with my family, with my grief, with everything I had left after Adeline died. A pause in which the entire room seemed to hold its breath. I am asking you one time, man to man. Were you in that barn the night of the fire? The silence stretched. Harlan looked at the documents on the counter. He looked at Mabel. He looked at Silas. He looked at Wes Cutter and Deke Alderman behind him, both of whom were now wearing the expressions of men who had started the morning expecting an ordinary Tuesday, and were reconsidering every choice that had brought them to this room. I went there to talk to her, Harlan said. That's all. I went to talk to Adeline. I knew she'd found some records I wanted to explain. Explain what? Orson said. That it wasn't what it looked like. That the horses, it was complicated. There were debts, Orson. You don't know what kind of pressure I was under that year. You went to burn the evidence, Mabel said. Not loudly, just clearly. I went to talk to her, Harlan said. And now his voice had the compressed, pressurized quality of a man whose story was collapsing inward, and who was trying to hold the edges together through sheer insistence. The fire was an accident. She had a lantern. I reached for the documents. She pulled back the lantern, went over. I didn't. It was never supposed to. You left her, Orson said. The words landed in the room like something physical. Harlan's mouth opened. She was alive when the fire started, Orson said. His voice was doing something now that Mabel had never heard it do. Cracking, but not the way a voice cracked from grief. Cracking the way a wall cracked when the pressure behind it finally exceeded what the structure could bear. You left her in that barn, and you walked away, and then you came to me, and you told me it was Gideon Voss. I was scared, Harlan said. Orson, I was scared. I didn't know how bad it would get. The fire moved so fast. You left my sister in a burning barn, Orson said, and then you spent 18 years coming to my kitchen and sitting at my table and letting me hate the wrong man. The room was absolutely silent. Mabel watched her father's face and felt something tear inside her chest. Not for herself, but for him, for the particular devastation of a man discovering that his grief had been hijacked. That the hatred which had organized his life for 18 years, which had given his pain a direction and a name and a reason, had been constructed by the person he trusted most out of the wreckage of his worst night. Harlan opened his mouth. The door of the records office opened. An old man came in. He was very old, somewhere past 70, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man whose body required negotiation, and he was wearing the worn, practical clothing of someone who had spent a working life outdoors. He had a face that had been weathered by decades of Colorado weather into something that looked carved rather than aged, and his eyes were pale gray and entirely steady. Mabel did not recognize him. Silas did. She saw it in the way. Silas went very still, not the stillness of surprise, but the stillness of recognition, landing in an unexpected place. "Virgil," Silas said quietly. The old man looked at Silas for a moment. "You look like your father," he said. "Same eyes." "People keep saying that today," Silas said. "Virgil Tatum." Because that was who he was. The name surfacing in Mabel's mind, from somewhere in the county's collective memory. An old stable worker who had left the area sometime in the years after the fire and been largely forgotten, walked into the room with the careful steps of a man who had been building up to something for a very long time and had finally decided that time had run out. "I heard you were in town," he said to no one in particular, looking at the assembled room with those steady gray eyes. "Word travels fast in a small county." His gaze settled on Harlan. "I've been waiting 20 years to be in the same room with you again." Harlan's face went a color that was not quite any natural color. "Virgil," he said, "you've got no business here." "I am," Orson said. "I was 17 years old the night of the fire," Virgil said. "I was working the night shift in the Voss stable. Your land bordered theirs, you know that. I saw the light in the Dorsey barn from across the field, and I went to look, because a light in a barn in the middle of the night is never a good thing." He did not look away from Orson. "I saw Harlan Pike come out of that barn. I saw him come out and walk away from the building without raising any alarm. By the time I started shouting for help, the hay had caught and it was moving too fast." "You were 17 years old," Harlan said. "You don't know what you saw." "I know exactly what I saw," Virgil said. "I've known for 50 years. I saw you walk out of that barn, Harlan. I saw you look back at the fire and keep walking." His voice was even unhurried, the voice of a man reciting something he had memorized long ago. "I was 17, and I was scared of what you'd do to me if I said anything, and I have lived with that every day since." He looked at Orson again. "I'm sorry I didn't speak sooner. I know that doesn't fix what it cost you." Orson did not say anything. He stood at the counter with Adeline's letter under his hand, and he looked at Virgil Tatum, and the expression on his face was something Mabel did not have a word for. Grief and relief and fury and devastation moving through him simultaneously, the way weather moved through a valley filling every available space. "Gideon Voss came to the barn," Virgil continued. "He arrived after I started shouting. He went in after her." A pause. "He couldn't get her out. The beam had come down. But he went in. He tried." He looked at Silas. "Your father tried to save her. I need you to know that." Silas's jaw was tight. "I know," he said quietly. "I think I've known for a while." Harlan moved. He moved fast for a large man turning toward the door with the sudden purposeful movement of someone who had calculated that the room had become unwinnable and was cutting his losses. He got 2 steps before Orson Dorsey put a hand on his arm. Orson was 61 years old and had spent 6 decades doing physical ranch work, and the hand he put on Harlan's arm was not the hand of an old man. "No," Orson said. "One word." Harlan stopped. "You don't get to walk away from this," Orson said. "Not again." Deke Alderman took a very deliberate step backward, placing himself outside the circle of this thing entirely. Wes Cutter looked at the floor. Harlan turned back to face the room, and what was on his face now was something stripped of all the performance, no warmth, no authority, no avuncular concern. Just a man at the end of a long road that had finally closed. "I can't give you back the years," Harlan said. His voice had gone flat, dull. "I know that. I knew when I came in here that I couldn't—" "Don't," Orson said. "Don't tell me what you can't do. Tell me about my sister. Tell me what she said to you in that barn before the fire started." A long silence. "She told me she wasn't afraid of me," Harlan said finally, and something in his voice broke when he said it. Something cracked through the flatness, and it sounded almost like the truth. "She looked right at me and told me she wasn't afraid of me, and that the sheriff would have everything he needed by morning." He exhaled. "Adeline was not a woman who bluffed." "No," Orson said. "She was not. I reached for the ledger. She didn't give it up. The lantern, it happened fast. I swear to you, Orson, I did not plan." "Did you go back for her?" Orson said. Harlan said nothing. "Did you go back into that barn for my sister?" Orson said. The silence answered. Orson let go of Harlan's arm. He stepped back one step, then two, as though he needed physical distance from the answer. Mabel moved toward her father and put her hand on his back between his shoulder blades, feeling the tension there, the contained and massive weight of what was moving through him. "Papa," she said quietly. He put his hand over hers briefly and then straightened. "Someone go find the sheriff," he said. His voice was the voice he used for decisions that had been made and would not be revisited. "It's time to let the county handle the rest of this." Ellsworth practically ran out the door. In the minutes while they waited, the room settled into an uneasy stillness. Harlan stood near this window. Wes Cutter had sat down on the bench near the wall and was studying his own boots with great attention. Deke Alderman had developed a sudden pressing need to be near the door, which he was near, but not through, because the moral arithmetic of that exit had become too complicated to navigate. Virgil Tatum sat down on the clerk's stool without being invited, with the certainty of a man who had earned a seat. Orson stood at the counter with Adeline's letter in his hands and did not speak. And then, not in the silence, but in the waiting, in the thick, complicated air of a room where the truth had just finished arriving, Silas crossed to where Orson stood. Mabel watched this. She watched it the way you watched something you hadn't expected and couldn't predict, without knowing what the next moment would contain, without being able to prepare for it. Silas stopped beside her father. "Mr. Dorsey," he said. "Quiet, direct." Orson looked at him. "My father failed to save your sister," Silas said. "That is a true thing. Whatever else was true about that night, he went into that barn and he failed to bring her out. He knew that for the rest of his life, and I think it's why he never came to you himself. Not because he was guilty of what you believed, but because he felt guilty of the thing he was actually guilty of not being fast enough." He paused. "I can't tell you that excuses his silence. I don't think it does. But I think you deserve to know that his silence came from grief, not from calculation." Orson was very still. "He helped me," Orson said. The words came out like they cost him something. "Anonymously, for years. I didn't know it was him." "I know," Silas said. "I found the records." "He paid down my debts," Orson said. 3 different drought years. I thought it was the church. I thought—" He stopped. Started again. "I spent 18 years cursing the name of the man who was keeping my ranch alive." The thing that happened to Orson Dorsey's face in that moment was not something Mabel could describe precisely then or later. It was the face of a man receiving a grief so layered and so contradictory that his features couldn't find a single expression to hold it. It moved through him in waves, the anger, the devastation, the guilt of his own misdirected hatred, the complicated and unwanted tenderness of learning that the man he had hated had quietly loved him enough to help him in secret. Mabel stepped forward and put the documents back into the metal box and latched it. "This goes to the sheriff," she said. "All of it. The original statement, the correspondence, the county records. All of it enters the official record today." "Agreed," Silas said. Orson said nothing, which was agreement enough. When Sheriff Dale Pruitt arrived, a spare, methodical man of 50, who had been sheriff of this county for 12 years, and had the demeanor of someone who had seen a great many things he hadn't expected and had learned to receive new information without visible disturbance. Mabel laid the case out for him in the same clear, organized voice she used when she was presenting ranch accounts. The documents, the county records, Virgil Tatum's testimony, Harlan's admission in front of witnesses. Pruitt listened without interrupting. He asked 3 questions, each of them precise. He looked at the documents himself. Then he looked at Harlan Pike. "Harlan," he said, "I think you'd better come with me." Harlan went. He walked out of the county records office between Pruitt and his deputy without the easy authority he had carried into that room an hour earlier, and the town of Cottonwood Divide, which had by now assembled a considerable informal audience on the street outside, watched him go. In a silence that was louder than anything the audience might have said, Mabel stood in the doorway and watched and felt not satisfaction, because satisfaction seemed like the wrong size for what had just happened. Something closer to the feeling of putting down a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. A release that was also a recognition of how long the carrying had been going on. Behind her she heard her father's voice. "Mabel," She turned. Orson was standing at the counter with Adeline's letter in both hands, and he was looking at it with an expression that she understood, because she knew him better than anyone alive. And what it said was that he was trying to find a place inside himself large enough to put this thing down. "You should have told me you were doing this," he said. "You were in Glenwood Springs," she said. "You know what I mean." She did know. "If I had told you," she said, "you would have told me to leave it alone, and I couldn't leave it alone." "Because of the Voss man." "Because of Adeline," Mabel said. Her voice was firm. "Because of you. Because 18 years of hating the wrong person is 18 years that belongs to you, and I wanted to give it back." Orson looked at her. Then he looked at Silas, who had remained near the window, giving the Dorseys the distance the moment required. "You," Orson said. Silas looked up. "What are your intentions?" Orson said. "On my land, with my daughter." A beat of silence. "I have no intentions on your land," Silas said. "My father's property is mine now. I'm not a man who takes what isn't his." He looked at Orson steadily. "As for your daughter, I don't have the standing to have intentions. That's her call to make." Orson looked at Mabel. Mabel looked at her father and did not look at Silas, and kept her expression exactly as neutral as she was capable of keeping it, which was quite neutral indeed. "She saved my life," Silas said, "before she knew whether I deserved it. That's not a debt I expect to repay because I don't think she did it expecting anything in return. But it's not something I'm going to forget either." He paused. "Your daughter is the most capable person I've met in 34 years of living, Mr. Dorsey. I mean that without qualification." Orson was quiet for a moment. "She is," he said. And something in the way he said it simple, direct, no surprise in it, as though it were simply a fact. He had always known, and was confirming for the first time out loud, made Mabel's throat tighten unexpectedly. She turned away and looked out the window at the street where Harlan Pike had just been walked to the sheriff's office. She thought about Adeline in that barn. Holding the ledger, not giving it up, telling a dangerous man that she was not afraid of him. She thought about her father running on grief for 18 years, fueled by a lie, pouring that grief into hatred, because grief without direction was unbearable, and Harlan had given it a direction. She thought about Gideon Voss carrying a map and a secret for 18 years, paying down a dead woman's brother's debts, in the dark guilt and loyalty and silence, wound together into something that had served no one well. She thought about all the time. The pure, irreplaceable, unrecoverable time. "Papa," she said, turning back. "She wasn't just brave, was she, Adeline?" Orson looked at her. "No," he said after a moment. "She wasn't just brave." Something shifted in his face. Something that was not entirely grief. Something softer than that. Something that might have been close to a smile if it had gotten a little further. "She was the most stubborn person I have ever known." He paused. "Until you." Mabel held that. She held it carefully, the way you held something that might break if you pressed it too hard. "You never told me that," she said. "I know," Orson said. "You spent 18 years telling me how she died," Mabel said. "You never told me how she lived." The words landed in the room. Orson received them without deflecting them, which was the bravest thing Mabel had seen him do in a long time, and she had watched her father do brave things her whole life. He received them, and he held them, and his face did the thing it did when he was confronting something he couldn't move around, and he said quietly and without excuse, "I know. I'm sorry, Rowena." He used her middle name. He only used it when something mattered beyond his ability to dress it in ordinary words. She crossed the room and put her arms around him, the way she hadn't done since she was small, and he held on with both arms, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and Silas stood near the window and looked at the street outside, and gave them the silence without being asked. Outside Cottonwood Divide was processing what it had just witnessed. The town had opinions. It had had opinions all week, ever since Harlan's careful campaign to discredit Mabel had begun moving through the gossip channels, and those opinions had not been kind. The story of the lonely, overweight woman who had lost her judgment to a handsome cowboy who happened to need rescuing had moved through the county's collective consciousness with the speed that unkind stories always moved. because unkind stories required no verification and left satisfying deposits in the accounts of people who enjoyed feeling superior. That story was now in some difficulty, because the handsome cowboy's arrival had apparently led not to Mabel's humiliation, but to the arrest of Harlan Pike, Orson Dorsey's most trusted friend and one of the county's most respected ranchers, for crimes committed 18 years ago against two families whose enmity had defined this corner of Colorado for nearly 2 decades. The people who had been most vocal about Mabel's foolishness were now recalibrating with the particular discomfort of people who had been loud in the wrong direction. Mabel came out of the records office with her father on one side and Silas on the other, and she carried the metal box under her arm, and she walked down the main street of Cottonwood Divide, the way she always walked, steady, unhurried, looking straight ahead. And she did not perform vindication or satisfaction or triumph for the watching town, because she had not done this for the watching town. She had done it for Adeline. She had done it for her father. She had done it because the truth had been sitting in a rusted box in a collapsed well for 18 years and deserved better. 3 people called out to her as she passed. Agnes Whitmore, who ran the dry goods, said, "Mabel," in a tone that contained an apology it didn't quite complete. Tom Eckhart, who had made a joke at Mabel's expense 4 days ago in the feed store, looked at the ground as she went by. Old Josie Pratt, who was 90 years old and had outlasted every opinion she'd ever been asked to hold, called out from her porch, in a voice that carried half the length of the street, "Good girl, Mabel Dorsey." Mabel lifted her hand to Josie without slowing down. At the end of the street before they reached the horses, Orson stopped. He looked at Silas. Silas looked back. 2 men standing in the particular charged silence of a county road in Colorado in 1889. Each of them carrying versions of the same history, neither of them certain yet what the next version was supposed to look like. "I blamed your father," Orson said. "I know," Silas said. "I said things about him. Did things, filed complaints, turned neighbors against the Voss name?" "I know," Silas said again. And then quietly, "He filed nothing against you. He said nothing to anyone. He thought he didn't have the right." Orson closed his eyes briefly. "He was wrong about that," Orson said. "Yes," Silas said. "He was." A long pause. "I don't know what to do with any of this today," Orson said. He said it with the bluntness of a man who had decided that honesty was the only currency left that wasn't counterfeit. "I don't know how to. I've hated your family for 18 years. I can't just—" "I know," Silas said. "I'm not asking you to." "Then what are you asking?" Silas looked at him steadily. "Time," he said. "That's all. Just time." Orson looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Mabel. And in the look was something Mabel had spent 29 years waiting for, without knowing she was waiting for it. Not approval exactly, not permission, but recognition. The look of a father seeing his daughter clearly. Seeing the full weight of what she had done, and what she was capable of, without the familiar softening that turned daughters into the simpler, safer versions fathers preferred. He saw her. "Time," Orson repeated, as though he was testing the weight of the word. "Yes, sir," Silas said. Orson picked up his reins. "Then let's go home," he said. "All of us, and figure out the rest from there." They rode home in a line. Orson first, then Mabel, then Silas. And nobody said much for the first mile, which was the right call. There were things moving through that space between them that needed room to settle before anyone tried to put words to them. And all 3 of them were practical enough to understand that. It was Orson who broke the silence, and he did it the way he did most things, without preamble, without ceremony. Getting directly to the point, as though the previous mile of quiet had simply been him choosing his words. "The Voss property," he said without turning around. "What's the state of it?" Silas rode up alongside him. "Neglected. The main barn needs roof work. The east pasture fence is down in 3 sections. The house is standing, but the windows need replacing before winter." A pause. "The breeding records are intact. My father kept meticulous records even when he let everything else go." "Breeding records," Orson said. "Going back 20 years. He had good instincts about bloodlines. Better than he had about most other things. Orson was quiet for a moment. Gideon always had an eye for horses, he said, and the way he said it, carefully. The way you handled something old and sharp told Mabel that there had been a time before the fire, before Harlan's lies had poisoned the well, when Orson Dorsey and Gideon Voss had occupied the same county without hatred. She filed that away. My father had an eye for horses, Silas said. He had a poor eye for people. He trusted Harlan because Harlan was friendly, and Harlan was useful, and my father was lonely after my mother left. That's about the whole of it. Same reason I trusted him, Orson said flatly. Another silence. I'm going to need help with the roof, Silas said. Orson looked at him sideways. Is that a request? It's an observation, Silas said. Mabel watched her father's face from 2 horse lengths back. She watched him receive this, the offer of ordinary work between men. The kind of offer that bypassed all the complicated emotional machinery and went straight to the practical, and she watched something in him consider it. I know a man in town who does roofing, Orson said finally. He's fair. Appreciated, Silas said. That was how it started. Not with a declaration, or a formal reconciliation, or a speech about forgiveness. It started with a roofing recommendation on a Colorado road in the early afternoon of the worst and best day either family had seen in 18 years. Mabel thought Adeline would have approved of that. The weeks that followed were not simple. Mabel had not expected them to be simple. She had not done any of this under the illusion that exposing the truth would immediately repair what the lie had broken. Truth had a way of clearing the ground, but it didn't do the building. That was slower work, and it required different tools. Harlan Pike was formally charged within a week of his arrest. The county proceeded with methodical efficiency. Once. Pruitt had the documentation in hand, the original complaint, the horse sale records, Virgil Tatum's sworn testimony, and Harlan's own partial admission, made in front of 6 witnesses. Deke Alderman, who had apparently decided that loyalty to Harlan was a significantly less attractive proposition, now that Harlan was in county custody, provided additional testimony about transactions he'd witnessed over the years without fully understanding. Wes Cutter said nothing, which was perhaps the most honest thing anyone in Harlan's orbit had done in years. The county's reaction to all of this moved through the predictable stages. First disbelief, then the recalibration that came with documented evidence, then the slow and slightly uncomfortable shift in social alignment that happened when a community discovered that the person it had trusted most was the person it should have trusted least. Several people who had made remarks about Mabel's judgment in the previous weeks now found reasons to stop by the Dorsey Ranch with preserves or extra grain, or questions about horse care that didn't require preserves or grain to address. Mabel received them with the particular politeness of a woman who had decided that vindication was private and charity was public, and she was not going to make anyone grovel for a mistake the whole county had been set up to make by a man skilled at manipulation. You're more generous than I'd be, Silas said one afternoon, watching the 3rd such visitor of the week ride away from the main house. I'm not generous, Mabel said. I'm practical. These are my neighbors. I have to live next to them for the rest of my life. Making them feel terrible about being wrong doesn't make them less wrong. It just makes them less likely to be honest with me in the future. Silas looked at her. That is simultaneously the most forgiving and the most strategic thing I have ever heard. Good, she said. That's about what I was going for. But the harder work was not with the neighbors. The harder work was Orson. Orson Dorsey was a man who had organized 18 years of grief around a certainty, and having that certainty removed did not immediately provide a new structure to replace it. He went through a period in those first weeks that Mabel recognized and worried about, quieter than usual, moving through the ranch, with the distracted precision of a man whose body knew the work, but whose mind was elsewhere, sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings, with Adeline's letters laid out in front of him, reading them again and again, the way you read something you needed to fully inhabit before you could put it down. She did not rush him. She brought coffee. She sat with him when he wanted company, and left him alone when he needed the other thing. She answered his questions when he had them, and did not manufacture comfort when she didn't have it to give. One evening about 3 weeks after Harlan's arrest, Orson looked up from the letters and said, I want to see the Voss property. Mabel looked at him. "All right," she said. "I want to see where Gideon lived," he said. "All those years." He folded the letters carefully. "I want to understand what kind of man does what he did. Pays a dead woman's brother's debts without ever putting his name on it. I can't make sense of that without seeing where it came from." "I'll ask Silas," Mabel said. Silas agreed without hesitation. They rode to the Voss property on a Thursday morning, all three of them, and Silas walked them through the house and the barn and the breeding pens with the quiet factual narration of a man showing someone a place he had complicated feelings about and had decided to present honestly rather than selectively. The property had the look of a place that had been maintained by one person for a long time. Everything functional, nothing comfortable. The minimum kept up and the rest allowed to age because there had been no one to notice and no reason to pretend. It was in the barn that Silas showed them the journals. They were stacked on a shelf above the breeding records. Plain ledger books, the same kind. Orson himself used for accounts filled with Gideon Voss's careful handwriting across 30 years of ranching life. Silas handed them to Orson without comment and let him look. Orson stood in the barn and opened the first journal. He read for a while. Then he turned to a section near the back that Silas had marked with a strip of leather, and he read that, and the expression on his face was something that Mabel thought she would carry for the rest of her life. The face of a man receiving a truth so disorienting that it required him to grieve something he had never known he'd lost. "He wrote about her," Orson said. His voice was very quiet. "Yes," Silas said. "About Adeline." Orson's finger was on the page. "He wrote about her like someone who respected her. Like someone who was—" He stopped, started again. "He was angry when she died. He was angry, and he didn't know what to do with it, and he couldn't tell anyone why, because everyone already thought—" "He already knew what everyone thought," Silas said. "And he believed he'd failed her. He'd gone to that barn to back her up, and he'd been too late, and he'd failed to get her out, and he thought that meant he had no right to his own grief." Orson closed the journal. He held it against his chest for a moment. Both arms wrapped around it, the gesture of a man holding something he couldn't put down and couldn't figure out how to carry. "How was keeping her secret even after she was gone?" Orson said. "He kept the map," Silas said. "Kept it for 18 years. He never went back to the well himself. I think he was waiting for someone who had the right to go there." "Adeline's family," Orson said. "Yes, sir." A long silence in which the barn creaked around them, and somewhere outside, a horse moved in a pen, and the ordinary sounds of a working property filled the space that words couldn't reach. "I owe your father an apology," Orson said. "I can't give it to him now. That's something I'm going to have to work out on my own." He looked at Silas with red-rimmed eyes that were not going to produce tears, because Orson Dorsey was constitutionally opposed to weeping in front of people, but which were doing their level best. "Can I give it to you instead? As a start?" Silas was quiet for a moment. "You can," he said. "But I want you to know I've got my own apology to make, for not coming sooner. My father tried to tell me those last days, and I wasn't ready to hear it. If I'd listened earlier, we could have—" "Don't," Orson said. "Don't do that to yourself. Grief makes us slow. It makes us careful about things that hurt even when the careful thing costs us." He looked down at the journal in his hands. "I know that better than most." Mabel stood near the barn door and watched her father and Silas Voss look at each other across the grave of 18 wasted years, and she felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't entirely known was tight. Some long-held breath, some braced for impact that had finally resolved into something she hadn't expected. Not resolution, not neatness, but something true. Something that had the texture of real things, rather than the smooth, finished surface of stories that tied themselves up too cleanly. It was on the way home from the Voss property that Mabel told her father about the dream. She had not planned to tell him that day. She had been carrying it for years, the particular private hope that a practical woman kept quiet, because practical women learned early. That hope, announced too loudly, became the thing other people felt entitled to comment on. But they were riding home through the late afternoon light, and Orson was quieter than usual, but a different kind of quiet than the grief quiet of the past weeks, and something in the quality of that silence made her take the chance. The burned pasture, she said. The east section. Orson looked at her. I've been thinking about it for a long time, she said. About what it could be, instead of what it was. She kept her eyes forward on the road ahead. Injured horses. Ones that ranchers can't afford to treat or don't have the time for. Ones that get discarded because they're not profitable to keep but aren't ready to be done. She felt the familiar bracing against dismissal. A recovery operation. Not a full ranch, a place where they can come and heal before they're placed somewhere useful. I know the treatment methods. I've been reading everything I could find for 3 years. Orson said nothing. She kept talking because she had started and stopping felt worse. I know what you're going to say. That it doesn't generate income that the land could be used for. I wasn't going to say that, Orson said. She looked at him. I was going to say I should have asked you that question years ago, he said. What you wanted to do with the land. What you thought it could be. His voice was gruff, which meant he was feeling something he didn't entirely know how to manage. I should have asked you a lot of things years ago. Mabel's throat did something complicated. Well, she said when she could. You're asking now. Tell me the rest of it, he said. She told him. She told him all of it, the whole plan she'd been building in the back of her mind for 3 years, detailed and practical and thoroughly considered, because when Mabel Dorsey allowed herself to dream, she did it with the same methodical attention she brought to everything else. Which horses? Which treatments? How many animals at a time? Where the money came from, which was partly from fees charged to ranchers who could pay, and partly from the savings she'd accumulated over years of managing the Dorsey accounts, with the kind of conservative efficiency that left small surpluses no one else had noticed. Orson listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he rode in silence for a moment. You've got enough saved for the first season's supplies, he said. Yes. The east pasture's been fallow for 18 years. The soil's recovered. I know, I checked it in spring. You've been planning this for 3 years and you checked the soil. 2 years ago, she admitted. I checked the soil 2 years ago. Something moved across Orson's face. And you never said anything. I didn't think you'd... She stopped. I thought you'd say it was impractical. It probably is impractical, Orson said. Most worthwhile things are. He looked ahead at the road. The land's yours to use. I should have told you that a long time ago, too. That evening, Silas came to the main house for supper for the first time. He came because Orson had asked him directly, simply without ceremony, and he came with the awareness that this was a significant threshold and the good sense not to comment on it. He sat at the Dorsey kitchen table and ate Mabel's cooking and talked to Orson about breeding records and roof timbers and the county proceedings against Harlan. And the conversation had the slightly careful quality of two people learning the shape of a new thing, testing where the edges were, but it was real conversation. The kind that built on itself rather than circling. After supper, while Orson sat with his pipe on the porch, Silas helped Mabel clear the table. They worked in the kitchen in a companionable quiet that had developed over the past weeks without either of them quite acknowledging it. The easy silence of two people who had spent enough time working alongside each other that the absence of words didn't feel like absence. He gave me the east pasture, Mabel said, stacking plates. Silas stopped. For the recovery operation. For Adeline Rest Ranch, she said. That's what I'm calling it. He was quiet for a moment. That's the right name, he said. I know. She turned from the counter. I need help, not money, labor. Someone who knows how to work with horses that have been damaged physically or otherwise. Someone who understands rehabilitation from the horse's side of it. She looked at him directly. I'm asking if you want to be involved. Silas looked at her. In the lamplight of the Dorsey kitchen, with the sound of Orson's chair on the porch coming through the door and the smell of the supper still in the air. He looked at Mabel Dorsey, and she looked back at him, and neither of them was performing anything. Yes, he said. I want to be involved. Good, she said. We start clearing the east pasture next week. She turned back to the counter. Behind her, she heard him say her name. Mabel. She turned again. I'm not going to help because I owe you something, he said. I'm not going to help to repay a debt or because it gives me a reason to stay on this land, or because I want something from you. He said it carefully, the way he said everything that mattered. I'm going to help because it's worth doing, and because you designed something worth building, and because... He stopped, looked at the counter, and then back at her. Because I can't think of anything I'd rather do with the next stretch of my life than build it. The kitchen was very quiet. That's a lot of reasons, Mabel said. I know, he said. I wanted to be thorough. She turned back to the counter because she needed a moment that wasn't visible, and she stood there for 3 seconds, looking at the wall and feeling something move through her that she did not have an immediate name for, something warm and terrifying and real. The feeling of a door opening into a room you had stopped expecting to find. Start with the fence line on the north side, she said when she could trust her voice. It needs restringing before we can put any animals in there. Yes, ma'am, he said. And then he went out to the porch to sit with Orson, and Mabel stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of the two of them talking low voices. The occasional pause, the sound of her father's pipe being tapped, and felt the shape of something new settling around her like a coat that fit. The work on the east pasture began on a Monday morning with 3 people, and expanded by Thursday to 5, when 2 of Orson's ranch hands, Jack Freely, and a young man named Amos Cole, who had been hired the previous spring and had the particular quality of someone who would work hard if you showed him what hard work produced, asked to be included. We heard what you're doing, Jack said. With the injured horses. You heard right, Mabel said. I got a horse at home that's been 3-legged since July, Jack said. Nobody's been able to figure it out. Bring him Saturday, Mabel said. We'll take a look. Jack's horse had the same hip problem as the bay mare. The compensation pattern Silas had recognized from the cabin door weeks and a lifetime ago. Silas and Mabel worked on him together. Silas talking through the approach, and Mabel's hands following the logic he described. And by the end of the morning, Jack was standing in the paddock, watching his horse move more freely than he'd moved in months, and the expression on his face was the kind that didn't need words. What do I owe you? Jack said. Nothing yet, Mabel said. When the ranch is officially running, we'll talk about rates. Right now, we're still learning. You ain't learning, Jack said, watching the horse. You already know. Amos Cole brought his younger sister the following week. Not a horse problem, but a question about whether Mabel needed help with the books, because his sister Clara had done her father's accounts since she was 14 and was looking for work. Mabel sat with Clara for 2 hours and hired her on the spot. You're building fast, Silas said that evening. They were sitting on the fence rail of the east pasture, the new fence rail straight and solid, the one they'd strung together over the course of a week, watching the last light move across the Colorado mountains. I've been planning for 3 years, Mabel said. The building is just the planning made physical. That's one way to describe it. What would you call it? I was quiet for a moment. I'd call it watching someone finally do the thing they were made to do, he said. And being glad I'm here to see it. She looked at him sideways. He was watching the mountains, his forearms on the top rail, easy and present in the way he was when he wasn't managing anything, when he was just himself in a place he'd decided was worth being. Silas, she said. He looked at her. In the cabin, she said. When you first told me your name, I thought I knew what you were going to be, what kind of man. She looked back at the mountains. I was wrong about most of it. What were you right about? He said. She thought about it honestly. That it was going to be complicated, she said. I was right about that. He laughed a real laugh, quiet and unperformed, the kind that came out when something genuinely caught you. She had learned that she liked that laugh considerably more than was entirely sensible. Mabel, he said when the laugh had settled. What? I've been in a lot of places, he said. I've worked with good people and difficult horses and land that didn't want to be worked and seasons that were trying their hardest to finish me off. He paused. I have never been anywhere that felt like I was in the right place until about 3 weeks after you dragged me out of a hollow and told me I owed you nothing. She looked at him. I reckon that's something you should know, he said. Not because I expect anything from it. Just because it's true, and I'd rather say true things than the other kind. The evening air off the mountains was cold now, carrying the first real edge of autumn, turning toward winter. and the east pasture fence stretched out around them in the dusk, and somewhere across the property line, the Voss barn sat with its roof work half completed and its journals on the shelf and the long history of two families in its walls. Mabel sat on the fence rail beside Silas Voss and felt the weight of the past several weeks, the mud and the blood and the fever, watch and the rusted box and the county records office, and her father's face reading Adeline's handwriting, and Harlan Pike walking out into a Tuesday that had ended his long undiscovered life. She felt all of it settle down through her like sediment, finding the bottom of still water, and what was left when it settled was something clear. "You should stay," she said, "for the winter. There's too much to do to lose another set of hands." Silas looked at her carefully. "Just for the winter," he said. "To start," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "All right." "Good," she said. "Is that all you're going to say about it?" "I might say more later," she said, "when I've thought about it more carefully." "You've been thinking about it for a month," he said. "I like to be thorough," she said. He shook his head slightly, the expression of a man who had accepted that this was simply how this particular woman operated and had made his peace with it, and possibly more than his peace. Inside the main house, a lamp came on in the kitchen window. Orson settling in for the evening with whatever he'd decided to read, or perhaps with Adeline's letters again, working through them one more time, learning his sister in a different direction than grief had allowed him to before. Mabel watched the lamplight and thought about the east pasture waiting to become something, and the fence line waiting to hold it, and the winter coming down off the mountains, and everything that was going to need to be built before the first horses arrived in spring. "We should go in," she said. "There's planning to do." "There's always planning to do," Silas said, climbing down from the rail. "Yes," Mabel said. "That's how things get built." She climbed down too, and they walked back toward the house together in the early dark, not touching, not performing anything. Just two people moving in the same direction at the same pace, which was, Mabel thought, about the most honest description of what they were becoming that she knew how to put into words. The first horse arrived at Adeline Rest Ranch on a Tuesday morning in April, and her name was Ginger, and she was in terrible shape. She came in a borrowed wagon from a rancher named Sutherland, who worked land 40 miles north, and who had heard about what Mabel Dorsey was building through the particular grapevine that ran through Colorado ranch country, word of mouth between men who trusted horses more than people, and therefore paid close attention when someone with a genuine reputation for the work opened their doors. Sutherland was a lean, weathered man of 55 who did not waste words, and he stood at the back of the wagon and looked at Mabel with the expression of a man who had rehearsed an explanation he was hoping he wouldn't need to give. "She was a cutting horse," he said. "Best I ever had. Took a fall in November. My man said she'd never work right again. I was going to—" He stopped. "My granddaughter named her. I couldn't do it." Mabel looked at Ginger. The mare was standing with her weight distributed wrong, her right foreleg held at the careful angle of an animal that had learned to manage pain through positioning. Her coat was dull. Her eyes were quiet in the particular way that said she had stopped expecting things to get better. Mabel had seen that look before. On horses. On people. She understood it both ways. "Leave her with us," Mabel said. "You haven't heard my price yet," Sutherland said. "We'll settle the price after you see what we do," Mabel said. "That's how we work here." Sutherland looked at her for a moment. Then he looked past her at Silas, who was standing near the gate with his arms on the top rail, and then at the east pasture behind them, the fence straight and new, the recovery pens clean and properly constructed, the whole operation, carrying the quiet, unshowy authority of something built by people who knew what they were doing. "All right," Sutherland said. Ginger came off the wagon carefully. Mabel's hands steady on her lead, talking to the mare the whole time in the low, continuous murmur that meant nothing in words and everything in tone. And when all four hooves were on, Dorsey ground, the mare stood still for a moment and exhaled a long, slow breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs. "She knows," Amos Cole said quietly from behind Mabel. "She doesn't know anything yet," Mabel said. "She's just tired of the wagon." But she reached up and put her hand flat on the mare's neck, and Ginger turned her head slightly toward the pressure, and Mabel let herself think privately that Amos might not be entirely wrong. By the end of April, there were 4 horses in the recovery pens. By the end of May, there were 7. By July, when the Colorado summer was at its most relentless, and the workdays stretched from before first light to well past dark, there were 11 animals in various stages of rehabilitation, a waiting list that Mabel managed with the same methodical care she'd always applied to the Dorsey accounts, and a reputation that had traveled well past the 40 miles Sutherland had come. Clara Cole kept the books. Jack Freely managed the feeding schedule with Amos. Silas worked the rehabilitation pens from dawn until whatever hour the last animal needed, and Mabel moved through all of it like the center of a wheel, not performing authority, not announcing herself, simply being the person that every question eventually reached and from whom every answer eventually came. Orson kept the main ranch running. He had aged differently in the months since the county records office. Not worse differently. The particular tightness that had lived around his mouth and eyes for as long as Mabel could remember the tension of a man carrying a sustained and organized hatred had released, and what replaced it was something quieter and less certain, but more genuinely his. He moved through his days without the old anger to fuel him, which meant some days he moved more slowly, and some days he sat on the porch in the evening and read Adeline's letters again. And some days he rode the boundary line that used to separate Dorsey land from Voss land, the line that had been moved officially when Silas and Orson had agreed to consolidate the grazing rights into a single working territory. And Mabel did not ask him what he was thinking on those rides, because she had learned that her father's grief was still processing itself, and the most useful thing she could do was let him. But he was present. He was more present than he had been in years. And he was proud. He was proud in the way of a man who had spent too long withholding something and was now making up for lost time, and it showed in the way he talked about the ranch to anyone who asked, and in the way he had quietly framed a photograph of Adeline and Mabel side by side, found among Adeline's recovered letters, a photograph Mabel had never seen before, and placed it on the mantel beside the original. Mabel noticed the photograph on a Thursday evening and stood in front of it for a long time without speaking. "She looked like you," Orson said from the doorway where he'd been watching her look at it. "Around the eyes. The way you both looked at things head on." He paused. "I should have told you that 20 years ago." "You're telling me now," Mabel said. "Is that enough?" She turned to look at him. "It's enough for today," she said. "Ask me again tomorrow." He almost smiled. That was new too. The trial of Harlan Pike concluded in late June. Mabel attended every session. She sat in the county courthouse on the hard wooden benches and listened to the evidence she had helped assemble, presented by the county attorney, with the methodical efficiency of a man who understood that the documents did most of the work. She listened to Virgil Tatum testify again, his voice steady and his pale gray eyes fixed on a point above Harlan's head, throughout delivering his account of the night of the fire, with the precision of a man who had rehearsed it in his own mind for 50 years and knew every word of it by heart. She listened to Harlan's lawyer argue context and confusion, and the deterioration of an old man's memory, which was the best available defense when the evidence was this comprehensive and this clear. She listened to the verdict. Guilty. The courtroom received it with the particular quality of silence that came when something that had been building for a very long time finally landed. Not shock, not satisfaction. Just the weight of a truth completing its journey from the place where it had been buried to the place where it could do no more damage in the dark. Harlan was led out without looking at the gallery. Mabel sat for a moment after the courtroom began to empty. Silas was beside her. He had come every day too for different reasons, carrying his own accounting of what this verdict meant, and he did not fill the silence with words, which was one of the things she had come to value about him most. "It doesn't bring her back," Mabel said finally. "No," Silas said. "It doesn't give my father 18 years. No, it doesn't." She stopped, looked at her hands in her lap. "I thought it would feel like more. I thought when it was over I would feel like it was enough," Silas said. "Yes. I think it might feel like enough later," he said. "I think today it just feels like true, and true is all it was ever going to be. The rest takes longer." She looked at him. That's unexpectedly wise. Don't sound so surprised. She stood up. Come on, she said. We have 4 horses waiting. They walked out of the courthouse into the July heat and rode back to Adeline Rest Ranch and went straight to work, because work was the most honest thing either of them knew how to do with a day that held more than it could comfortably carry. It was 2 weeks after the verdict that the article appeared. A man named Collins from a Denver newspaper had apparently heard about Adeline Rest Ranch through the same grapevine that had been sending horses to the east pasture all spring, and he had ridden down from Denver with a notebook and the particular enthusiasm of a journalist who understood that the story in front of him was better than anything he'd anticipated. He spent 2 days on the property, watching Mabel work, talking to Silas and Jack and Clara, interviewing Sutherland by correspondence about Ginger, who was by then moving with a recovered ease that made grown men who worked with horses go quiet when they saw her. The article ran in mid-July under the headline, "The Woman Who Heals Horses Other Men Have Given Up On." Mabel read it at the kitchen table, while Orson read it over her shoulder, and Silas sat across from them both with his coffee and the carefully neutral expression of a man who had already read it and formed an opinion about her reaction to it. "He spelled my name right," Mabel said. "He spelled everything right," Orson said. "He also wrote that he found the line, possessed of the kind of competence that requires no announcement, because every animal on the property has already voted with their recovery." "That's a reasonable sentence," Mabel said. "It's a good sentence," Silas said. "Don't start," she said. "I'm not starting anything," Silas said. "I'm agreeing with the Denver newspaper." She set the article down. "It's going to bring more people," she said, already thinking ahead. "We need another pen built before the fall requests come in. And we need to talk to Amos about whether he's willing to take on more animals, or whether we need to hire another—" "Mabel," Orson said. She looked up. "Let it matter for 5 minutes," he said. "Before you plan the next thing, let it matter for just 5 minutes." She looked at her father. She looked at the article on the table. She looked at the photograph of Adeline on the mantel, visible through the kitchen doorway, the woman she had never gotten to know while she was living and was finally getting to know now. "All right," she said. 5 minutes." She sat there for 5 minutes and let it matter. Then she got up and went to find Amos. The conversation about the future of the ranch happened in September, on an evening when the air had gone cool, and the mountains were doing something spectacular with the light that neither Mabel nor Silas acknowledged, because they were focused on each other, which was where their attention generally ended up. They were walking the boundary line. What used to be the boundary line. The stone wall that ran along the old Dorsey Voss divide, most of it now dismantled. Orson had made the decision to take it down over the summer, working section by section, with Jack's help on the days when the symbolic weight of it seemed to fuel him rather than exhaust him. Most of it was gone. One section remained standing at the south end, near the place where the Dorsey fence posts met the old wall about 30 feet from the hollow, where Mabel had found Silas on a rainy September morning exactly 1 year ago. She had not planned for the walk to end up there. It simply did, the way walks sometimes resolved themselves into the places that mattered most. They stood at the remaining section of the old wall, and Mabel looked at it, and Silas looked at her looking at it. "We should take this last section down," she said. "We could," he said, "or we could leave it." "Why would we leave it?" "Because it's the place where you found me," he said. "And I think that deserves to be marked somehow, even if the marking is just one old wall standing where it doesn't entirely make sense anymore." She looked at the wall, at the fence post behind it, the Dorsey post she had fixed the morning after she'd found him going back to work because the fence needed fixing and the world required practical things done, regardless of what else was happening in it. "It doesn't have to mean what it used to mean," Silas said. "That's the thing about keeping something. You get to decide what you're keeping it for." "You've been thinking about this," she said. "I've been thinking about a few things," he said. She looked at him. Something in his tone had shifted, not dramatically, not with the performed significance that preceded speeches in novels. Just the small tonal change of a man who was moving from one kind of conversation into another and was being honest about it. "Mabel," he said. "Silas," she said. "I want to say something," he said. "And I want to say it here at this spot because this is where it started, and I think it ought to be said where it started." "All right," she said. He looked at the remaining section of wall, then at her. "I know who I am," he said. "I'm not a man who came here with money or standing or an untangled family history. I came here on a spooked horse in a rainstorm and fell off and nearly died in a hollow on your land. And the first thing I did when I woke up was ask whether my horse was lame." He said it without self-deprecation, just factually. "You knew exactly who you were pulling out of that mud. You knew the name before you knew the man, and the name was the worst possible name for someone on Dorsey land to have. And you pulled him out anyway." She did not say anything. "You gave me a chance before you knew whether I deserved one," he said. "That is the most significant thing anyone has ever done for me, and I want you to know that I understand the size of it. I understood it when you did it, and every day I've been on this land has made me understand it more." He paused. "I don't want another life where I have to ride away from you. I don't want to imagine what the East pasture looks like in 10 years without you running it and me beside you. I don't want to keep not saying the thing I've been thinking since about the 4th day in that cabin, which is that I have never in 34 years of living met anyone who made me feel like the right person in the right place the way you do." He looked at her directly. "Mabel Rowena Dorsey, will you marry me?" The old wall stood in the September evening. The hollow where she'd found him lay 30 feet away, green, now nothing to distinguish it from any other patch of Colorado ground except the knowledge of what had happened there. Mabel looked at Silas Voss, at the dark eyes and the weathered face and the shoulder that had healed clean, at the man who had asked about his horse before he asked about himself, who had told her the truth when it would have been easier to manage her, who had stood in a barn with her father and offered apology without transaction and help without strings and presents, without the assumption that his presence was a gift rather than a choice. She thought about the morning she'd found him, about every choice she'd made between that morning and this one, about every choice she hadn't made, every door she hadn't walked through in 29 years, because she'd learned too early to count the cost before she counted the possibility. She had found him at a boundary line. She had chosen then to move past the boundary. "Yes," she said. One word, clear and definite and entirely without hesitation, because she had been thinking about it since about the 4th day in the cabin too, and had simply been waiting for the moment when saying it out loud felt like the true thing rather than the terrifying thing. The true thing had arrived. Silas exhaled. A real breath, the breath of a man who had been holding something and had just let it go. He took her hand. Not dramatically, just took it, her work-roughened hand, in his, holding on with the straightforward grip of a man who had made a decision he intended to keep. She held on back. They stood at the old wall in the September light for a while, not needing to fill it with words, because some moments were already full. They were married in October on a Saturday, when the Colorado sky was the particular clear blue that only happened in autumn, with the cold coming in off the mountains, and the East pasture, visible from where the ceremony was held, and 4 of Adeline Rest Ranch's current residents, watching from their recovery pens with the serene disinterest of animals with more important things on their minds. Orson stood at the front of the assembled guests with Adeline's journal under his arm. He had carried it since the morning, not for any formal reason Mabel understood, but because carrying it felt right to him. Because this was a day Adeline should have been present for, and this was how Orson Dorsey had found to bring her. The ceremony was performed by the same county judge who had delivered Harlan Pike's verdict 4 months earlier, which Mabel found appropriate in a way she couldn't entirely articulate, but didn't need to. Judge Harmon was a practical man who delivered practical ceremonies without excessive ornamentation, and that suited Mabel and Silas equally. When it was done, when the judge said the final words, and Silas took her hands and looked at her with those dark eyes that she had learned to read as thoroughly as she read the recovery signs in a healing horse, Mabel felt the moment settle into her. The way true things settled, not with fireworks or overwhelm, but with the quiet certainty of something that had found its correct place. The celebration afterward was on the ranch tables set up in the yard, food that half the women in Cottonwood Divide had contributed, because the story of Mabel Dorsey and Silas Voss had become the county's story too, in the way that stories about truth and long wrongs and unexpected courage became communal property. Old Josie Pratt was there, 90 years old, and still carrying opinions louder than most people half her age. And she ate 2 full plates of food, and declared that she had always known Mabel Dorsey would do something worth watching. Virgil Tatum came. He sat near the edge of the gathering with a plate of food and a cup of coffee, and the quiet satisfaction of a man who had spent 50 years carrying a weight, and had finally in his last years found the place to set it down. Mabel went to him specifically, while Silas was talking with Orson and Jack. Freely was attempting to teach Amos a card game with rules that seemed to change each time someone won. "Virgil," she said, sitting beside him. "Mrs. Voss," he said with the small formal acknowledgement of an old-fashioned man greeting a newly married woman. "Not yet used to that," she said. "You'll get there," he said. She sat with him for a moment. "You know Adeline would have been furious," she said, "that it took this long." Something moved in Virgil's pale gray eyes. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "She would have had considerable things to say about the 50-year timeline." "She would have been right," Mabel said. "She generally was," Virgil said. And something in the way he said it, simple, unguarded, the voice of a 17-year-old boy, preserved perfectly inside a 70-year-old man, told Mabel that Adeline had mattered to Virgil Tatum in ways that had lived in him quietly all his life. And she did not press it, because some things deserved to remain private, even when they were also part of a larger story. "Thank you," Mabel said, "for coming, for speaking, for all of it." "Thank you," he said, "for being the kind of woman who goes looking." She went back to her husband. Her husband. The word was new, and she turned it over experimentally as she crossed the yard, testing its weight, finding that it fit the way well-made things fit. Not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was exactly the right size. Silas saw her coming and watched her the whole way across the yard, with the open, unguarded attention of a man who had given himself permission to stop managing what showed on his face where she was concerned. "Virgil all right," he said when she reached him. "Virgil is good," she said. "Virgil is better than he's been in a long time, I think." "Good." He handed her a cup of coffee. "Your father is telling Jack freely about the time I tried to make beans one-handed in the cabin. Oh no, it has become considerably more dramatic in the retelling." "Are you losing the story?" "Significantly," he said. "Apparently, I also spilled the entire pot." "Did you?" "I did not spill the entire pot." "How much did you spill?" A pause. "Some of it," he said. She laughed. A real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere undefended, and Silas watched it happen with the expression he got when she laughed. The particular expression she had learned to recognize as something he didn't quite have a name for, but wore whenever she was most fully herself. "I want to show you something," he said. I took her hand, and they slipped away from the edge of the celebration, walking the familiar path down toward the south end of the property, and she knew where they were going before they got there. The last section of the old boundary wall. Someone had put wild flowers on it. She didn't know who, maybe Orson, maybe Clara Cole, maybe nobody she'd be able to identify, but there was a small bunch of late-season Colorado wildflowers laid on the top of the old stone, and in the early evening light, they looked exactly right. "I want to show you this," Silas said, and he reached into his coat and produced a piece of paper folded once and handed it to her. She unfolded it. It was a drawing. A brand design drawn in Silas's careful hand. He had an eye for lines. She'd discovered the precision of a man who'd spent decades reading the marks burned into leather and understood what made a brand legible and lasting. 2 horseshoes joined at the heel, curving toward each other. Not the split horseshoe of black pine, not the Dorsey mark, but both of them modified and brought together. Beneath them a single pine branch, not a black pine standing alone. A branch from something larger, something that had context and root. "For the ranch," Silas said. "If you want it, it's your decision." Mabel looked at the drawing for a long moment. "The old brands stay in the record books," she said. "We don't erase them." "No," Silas said. "We don't erase anything. But we put this one on everything going forward." She looked up from the drawing. "It's right," she said. "It's exactly right." "I thought so," he said. "I've been thinking about it since spring." She folded the drawing and put it in her pocket beside her heart, where she intended it to stay until morning, when she would take it to the man in town, who burned brands and set it into the official county record as the mark of Adeline Rest Ranch. 2 horseshoes joined. 1 pine branch. 2 families. 2 griefs. 2 18-year silences, brought together not by forgetting, but by choosing deliberately, and with full knowledge of the cost, to build something new on the ground where the old things had stood. Silas put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him the way she had learned to lean into things that were solid without performing the leaning, without making it mean more than it was just accepting the reality of something steady when it was offered. They stood at the old boundary wall in the October evening. Behind them, the celebration continued, voices and laughter, and Orson's particular carrying tone when he was deep in a story. And somewhere in the east pasture, one of the recovery horses called out once and was answered by another, the ordinary sound of animals in a place where they had been given time to heal. In the years that followed, travelers through Cottonwood Divide heard the story in different versions. Some told it as the story of the 2 ranching families whose hatred had been built on a lie and dismantled by a woman with a rusted metal box and the stubbornness to go looking. Some told it as the mystery of the fire and the old crime, and the man who had spent 18 years keeping a secret that destroyed 2 families. Some told it as the romance, the plus-size ranch woman and the wounded cowboy she'd found at her fence line, the love story that started with mud and fever, and a brand that should have ended everything before it began. But the simplest version was still the truest. A woman found a dying stranger in the rain. She saw the mark that her father had taught her to fear above all others. She had every reason in the world to ride away. She chose to stay. That one choice pulled the thread that unraveled an 18-year lie, restored the name of a man who had been silent in his own defense, gave a grieving father his sister, back in the only form she had left the truth of who she was, and gave Mabel Dorsey the courage to stop measuring herself through the eyes of people who had never bothered to look at her clearly. The boundary fence came down. The east pasture bloomed with the work of healing. The old brands stayed in the record books because you did not erase what had happened. You carried it forward into the thing you built next. And the new brand burned into the leather of everything that left Adeline Rest Ranch. Every halter, every saddle skirt, every piece of equipment that carried the mark of what this place had become, bore the image of 2 horseshoes joined beneath a single pine branch, which meant to everyone who learned to read it that this was a place where broken things came to be made whole, where the past was neither denied nor worshipped, but carried honestly into a future built by people who had chosen with full knowledge of the cost to choose each other over the stories they'd been told. Mabel Voss née Dorsey ran that ranch for 31 more years. She never stopped going looking. And every single thing she ever found was worth finding.